Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail on the most luxurious disaster in human history. Life as one of the filthy rich aboard the Titanic. Not the Leonardo DiCaprio version, not the steamy handprint on the foggy window version. I mean the real thing. A floating palace stuffed with millionaires, marble staircases, and an almost religious confidence that nothing could possibly go wrong. Tonight, you're not shoveling coal in the boiler room until your lungs turn the colour of regret. You're not scrubbing a deck the size of a football field on your knees. No, tonight you are rich. Filthy, obscene. More money than sense rich. The kind of rich where someone else butters your toast, draws your bath, and gently informs you what day it is. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas genuinely shape what gets made on this channel, and a little nudge in the comments does more than you'd think to keep this whole thing afloat, which is more than we can say for the ship. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always strangely comforting to see who's drifting off alongside you from around the world. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and settle in somewhere soft, because for the next little while, you have staff. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be wealthy aboard the Titanic? Did the rich even know how to dress themselves, or had they outsourced that too? How many forks does a single dinner need before it stops being a meal and starts being a threat? Could you survive an entire week at sea with 11 courses a night, a heated swimming pool, and absolutely nothing whatsoever to do? Would you have believed them when they whispered that the ship couldn't sink? Or would you have been the insufferable one at dinner asking, ever so politely, where exactly the lifeboats were kept? And now, congratulations! You've just woken up on the morning of April 10th, 1912, in a bed softer than anything you will ever afford in your real life, aboard a ship that everyone on Earth swears cannot possibly go down. The sheets are Irish linen, the light is golden, and somewhere far to the north, in water you cannot yet imagine, something very large and very patient is waiting. But that's days away. For now, you're rich. Enjoy it. You step onto the dock at Southampton and look up, and then a little more up, because the Titanic does not so much sit in the water as loom over the city like a building that got bored of being on land. She's nearly 900 feet of riveted steel, 11 stories tall, longer than any moving object humans have ever built, and you're about to live inside her like she's a slightly damp hotel. Smoke curls from 4 enormous funnels, though one of them is purely decorative, added because 3 funnels apparently didn't look rich enough, which tells you everything about the philosophy at work here. Porters in crisp uniforms whisk your luggage away before you've finished deciding whether you wanted them to. You haven't even boarded yet, and already nobody will let you carry anything heavier than your own opinions. There are separate gangways for separate kinds of people, and naturally you ascend the one reserved for first class, gliding upward while somewhere below several hundred emigrants shuffle aboard through an entrance you will never see and into a world you will never visit. The morning air smells of coal smoke, salt, rope, and faintly of fresh paint, because the ship is so new that parts of her are technically still drying. This is the maiden voyage. Nobody has worn this carpet in. You are, in a sense, the very first guests in a hotel that has existed for about 5 minutes, which is thrilling right up until you remember that nobody has tested anything either. As you settle in, the ship prepares to depart, and here the Titanic delivers her first small omen, the kind you'll only appreciate in hindsight. As she eases away from the quay, the sheer volume of water her hull displaces drags at a smaller liner moored nearby, the New York, snapping its mooring ropes like threads and pulling its stern swinging toward you. For a long, breathless moment, the two ships drift toward an introduction nobody arranged, before quick work with the tugs and the engines nudges them apart. A near miss, a few feet of seawater between maiden voyage and minor scandal. Everyone laughs it off, the way you laugh off the smoke alarm that goes off the instant you move into a new house. Inside, the scale stops being impressive and becomes faintly absurd. Corridors run longer than some streets you've lived on. There are elevators, electric ones, lifting you between decks with a gentle hum, because walking upstairs is apparently a hardship the wealthy should be spared whenever possible. There are public rooms grander than the finest hotels on land, and there is the constant soft thrum of the engines somewhere far below. The heartbeat of a vessel built to make crossing 3,000 miles of hostile ocean feel like an extended weekend at a spa. And that, in the end, is the entire point of her. The Titanic is not really a ship in the way you might think of a ship. She is a statement, a floating argument that money has finally, conclusively defeated distance, danger, and discomfort all at once. You're not a passenger so much as a resident of a small, glamorous town that happens to be moving at 20-odd knots toward New York. It is the most magnificent thing you have ever stood inside. It is also, though no one will say it, a town with nowhere to run. But first, let's find out where you'll be sleeping. Let's talk about where you'll be sleeping, because it is frankly obscene. Down a carpeted corridor that smells faintly of fresh paint and money, your steward opens a door onto a suite that would make a duke feel underdressed. There are multiple rooms. Yes, rooms, plural, on a boat, with mahogany panelling, a marble washstand, electric heating, and a private promenade deck where you can stroll about looking wistful at the sea without a single peasant in sight. The most expensive of these parlour suites cost roughly what a comfortable family home cost on dry land, which means you have spent a house to float across the Atlantic for a week. And the truly remarkable part is that you will spend most of that week somewhere else entirely, because the ship has given you far too many other rooms to be impressed by. Step inside and take inventory of your good fortune. The bed is a proper bed, not a bunk, dressed in linen so fine it feels faintly judgmental of your normal sheets. There is a sitting room with a sofa, writing desk and reading lamps. There is hot and cold running water at a time when much of the world considered a single working tap a triumph of modern living. There is a wardrobe room, a room specifically for clothing, because the volume of outfits you've brought genuinely requires its own postal code. There is even a little electric bell to summon your steward, who exists in a permanent state of readiness somewhere down the corridor, prepared to materialize the instant you develop a whim. The decoration follows a theme, because the designers, in a fit of ambition, gave the grandest suites their own historical styles, recreating the look of various periods so that you might sleep surrounded by the aesthetic of long-dead aristocrats. It is the Edwardian equivalent of booking the themed honeymoon suite, only the theme is centuries of inherited European wealth and the bill could fund a small business. Your suite, in short, is trying very hard to convince you that you're not on a boat at all, and it is succeeding. Right up until a gentle roll of the sea reminds you that 3,000 fathoms of cold Atlantic are passing silently beneath the floorboards. Consider for a moment the genuine madness of the expense. The grandest of these suites cost a sum that could have kept an ordinary working family fed, housed, and clothed for a decade or more. You're paying it for 1 week, for a bed you will barely sleep in a town the size of a postage stamp that you've already decided to spend lounging in chairs elsewhere. The very rich did not buy these rooms because they needed the space. They bought them because someone, somewhere, would know they could. And so you unpack, or rather your maid unpacks for you, settling your impossible quantity of clothing into its dedicated room, while you test the sofa and ring the bell once just to confirm it works. The steward appears. He always appears. Outside the porthole the harbour slides away and the open sea begins to widen ahead. grey and glittering and enormous. You've spent a fortune on the finest cabin afloat. But there is a small ritual you must perform before you can be seen anywhere worth being seen, and it begins with the grandest set of stairs ever bolted to a ship. At the heart of the ship, beneath a wrought iron and glass dome that pours daylight down like a blessing, stands the grand staircase, and it exists for one reason, so that you can walk down it slowly while people watch. Carved oak, gilded balustrades, a cherub holding a lamp at the bottom, and a clock framed by figures meant to represent honour and glory crowning time, which is a lot of marble dedicated to reminding you how rich you are while you go to dinner. Descending it correctly is an art form. You pause at the top, you let the gown settle. You place one gloved hand on the rail and float downward as though gravity itself were a service you'd paid for. It is, when you think about it, an enormous amount of architecture devoted to making the simple act of going downstairs feel like an entrance. The dome above is the master stroke. By day, sunlight filters through the ornate glass and falls across the oak in soft golden bars, so that the whole stairwell glows like the inside of a cathedral that took a wrong turn into the hospitality business. By night, it is lit from above by a great gilded fixture, warm and theatrical, designed so that no one descending will ever, even once, be poorly illuminated. Somebody thought very carefully about the lighting on these stairs. That is the level of consideration money buys. You will never look better walking down anything for the rest of your life, and everyone, of course, is performing. The staircase is the great social runway of the ship, the place where you are seen arriving before you arrive anywhere. The ladies time their descent for maximum effect, gowns catching the light, jewels doing their quiet, expensive work. The gentlemen come down in immaculate black and white, nodding to acquaintances, cataloguing who is wearing what and who is speaking to whom. It is a parade in which everyone is simultaneously the spectacle and the audience, a kind of slow-motion competitive elegance, like a red carpet that never quite ends and serves dinner at the bottom. There is a comedy to it, naturally, the moment you stop being dazzled and start paying attention. Here is the most advanced ship ever built, a triumph of engineering and ambition, and one of its proudest features is a really, really nice way to go downstairs. The clock alone, with its allegorical figures of honour and glory crowning time, is a small sculptural lecture on the dignity of the hour, mounted in a stairwell, on a boat, so that you might check the time with a sense of occasion. Nobody on this ship simply glances at a watch. They consult a monument. You learn the choreography quickly because everyone does. You do not clatter down like a person late for something. You descend. You allow the staircase to do for you what it was built to do, which is make an ordinary human being look briefly like the protagonist of an expensive painting. And when you reach the bottom, where the bronze cherub holds its lamp aloft in eternal, slightly baffled service, you step off onto the landing and into the swirl of the evening, fully aware that in a few hours you'll do the entire performance again in reverse, and that this somehow counts as one of the great pleasures of the voyage. But before any of that, there is the small matter of getting dressed, and on this ship that is not something you do alone. You might assume that putting on your own clothes is a basic human skill. Aboard the Titanic, among your social class, that assumption is adorable. Dressing is a collaborative production, involving your valet or your lady's maid, an alarming number of buttons located in places your own arms cannot reach, and a corset laced by someone else, with the quiet determination of a sailor securing rigging. Men have studs, cufflinks, waistcoats, and collars stiff enough to deflect light criticism. Women have layers within layers, each requiring a second pair of hands and roughly the patience of a saint. By the time you are fully assembled, you have been worked on like a parade float, and you will repeat this ritual several times a day, because changing outfits for each part of the day is not vanity here. It is law. Start with the architecture of a lady's evening, if you happen to be one. Beneath the gown lies an entire civilization of undergarments. The chemise, the corset cover, the petticoats, each laid out and applied in sequence by a maid who knows the order better than you do. The corset is the centerpiece of the operation, laced from behind with a steady, practiced pull that arranges your silhouette into the fashionable shape, whether your ribs are enthusiastic about it or not. You hold the bedpost. She braces and tugs. It is less like dressing, and more like being gently rigged for sail, and by the time the gown goes over the top, you have been assembled with the care and labour of a small construction project. The gentlemen escape lightly only by comparison. White tie for dinner means a stiff detachable collar that fastens with studs, a starched shirt front that could stop a draft, a white waistcoat, the tailcoat, the bow tie tied by hand, the cufflinks, the pocket watch, the polished shoes. None of it is designed for a man to manage alone, which is precisely why the valet exists, hovering with brushes and a faintly priestly air, smoothing lapels and correcting the angle of things you did not know had angles. You stand still and attended to like a horse before a very formal race. And here is the genuinely exhausting part. You do this several times a day. There is morning dress, and there is a different costume for luncheon, and something else again for afternoon promenading, and then the full evening regalia for dinner. To wear the same outfit from breakfast through to dinner would be, in this world, a small social catastrophe, the Edwardian equivalent of showing up to a wedding in the clothes you slept in. Your maid or valet spends much of the voyage pressing, brushing, mending and rotating this wardrobe, an invisible labour that keeps you looking effortless while being anything but. Pause to appreciate the sheer absurdity of it. You're aboard a ship surrounded by ocean, going nowhere you can walk to, and you change clothes 4 or 5 times a day to suit occasions you have invented. You require another adult human being to fasten your own back. You have outsourced the most fundamental task of self-maintenance to a staff member, and you consider this not helplessness, but refinement. It is a marvellous arrangement, provided you never stop to think about it, and the very rich were experts at never stopping to think about it. Fully dressed at last, buttoned and laced and gleaming, you are finally fit to be seen, which means you are finally fit to eat. And the eating, on this ship, never really stops. It begins, gently and enormously, with breakfast. Morning arrives, and with it the first feeding of the day, served in a dining saloon larger than most town halls. Breakfast is not a slice of toast eaten standing over the sink while you worry about your inbox. It is eggs prepared any of a dozen ways, grilled kidneys, smoked salmon, fresh fruit shipped aboard at no small expense, oatmeal, and a parade of breads, all delivered by waiters who appear and vanish like polite ghosts. You select from a printed menu the size of a small newspaper. You will not see a bill. You will not see the kitchen, the staff, or the staggering logistics required to keep several hundred wealthy people fed at sea. You will simply see food arrive and arrive and arrive until you begin to understand that on this ship the day is not measured in hours but in courses. The dining saloon itself is a vision in white and gold, the largest room afloat, stretching the full width of the ship and seating many hundreds beneath a panelled ceiling with leaded windows lit from behind to imitate daylight, even when you're somewhere in the middle of nowhere. You're shown to your table by a steward who remembers your name, your preferences, and quite possibly your moods, and you settle in among the gleaming silver, the heavy linen, and the soft clink of a room full of people who have never once worried about the price of eggs. And the choices are ridiculous, in the best sense. Fruit and stewed prunes, porridge and oatmeal, fish, including fresh haddock and smoked salmon, eggs done however you can imagine, fried, poached, boiled, scrambled in omelettes, grilled mutton kidneys, sizzling and faintly alarming, bacon, ham, sausage, grilled ox kidneys for the truly committed, then the breads, rolls, scones, cornbread, buckwheat cakes with syrup, toast in racks, all warm, all endless. It is less a meal than a buffet that has been given a tuxedo and taught manners, and you're expected to graze through it at a civilized pace while discussing absolutely nothing of consequence. Consider what is happening below your feet to make this possible. Down in the galleys, an army of cooks, bakers and scullery hands has been awake for hours, firing the great ranges, hauling provisions, cracking what must be a genuinely heroic number of eggs. The ship carried tens of thousands of eggs, thousands of pounds of fresh fish and meat, oceans of milk, mountains of flour, all loaded at the docks to keep this single dining room in a state of permanent abundance for a week. The modern equivalent would be checking into a hotel where the breakfast buffet simply never closes, never runs low, and is staffed by people you are encouraged to pretend do not exist. That last part is the quiet genius of it. The luxury is not only the food, the luxury is the invisibility of the effort. Nothing must ever appear to have required work. The kidneys must arrive grilled without evidence of a kitchen. The coffee must be poured without the pourer being noticed. You're meant to experience this groaning abundance as a kind of natural weather, food that simply happens, the way rain happens, rather than something dozens of people sweated to deliver. So you eat your eggs, sip your coffee, perhaps glance at the menu for tomorrow out of pure curiosity, and rise eventually no hungrier than you'll be in 3 hours when the next opportunity to eat presents itself. Because breakfast, lavish as it is merely the warm-up act. The real performance, the one the entire ship quietly revolves around, comes at the end of the day, and it arrives with more courses than you have fingers. Dinner in first class is less a meal and more a slow-motion endurance event dressed up as a celebration. Picture this: a printed menu offering 10 or 11 courses, beginning with oysters and rolling through soups, fish, a meat course, poultry, sorbet to politely reset your overwhelmed palate, roast lamb or duck, cold delicacies, vegetables, and finally an avalanche of pastries, eclairs, and fruit. Each course arrives with its own wine, its own cutlery, and its own unspoken rules about which fork commits which sin. By the end you have eaten for the better part of 2 hours and made the acquaintance of more forks than friends. Somewhere in the kitchens below, an army of cooks has been labouring all day so that you may struggle, gently and elegantly, to finish your 8th small plate. It begins, as all civilized catastrophes do, with oysters served cold and glistening, followed by your choice of soups, a clear consommé or a creamier alternative for those committing fully to the evening. Then the fish, perhaps a poached salmon in a delicate sauce, arriving on its own plate with its own dedicated fork, because heaven forbid the fish fork ever brush shoulders with a lesser fork. Already you are several courses deep, and the kitchen has barely cleared its throat. Then the main events arrive in waves, a fillet of beef, tender and small and perfect, a sauté of chicken in a rich Lyonnaise style, lamb with mint sauce, roast duckling with applesauce, a sirloin of beef for the heroic. And just when your body begins, reasonably, to suspect the meal might be winding down, the waiters bring out the punch romaine, a slushy, faintly alcoholic sorbet, served not as dessert but as a palate cleanser, a deliberate pause inserted into the middle of dinner so that you may forget everything you have eaten and begin, somehow, again. It is the dining equivalent of a half-time show, and it exists purely so that the back half of the meal can hit you fresh. Refreshed and faintly drunk on iced punch, you press on into roast squab, cold asparagus dressed in vinaigrette, and pâté de foie gras, the famous fattened goose liver, served because nothing says refined like a delicacy with a backstory best left undiscussed. And then, at long last, the desserts descend like a sugary cavalry. Waldorf pudding, peaches and chartreuse jelly, chocolate and vanilla eclairs, French ice cream, a cart of fruit and cheese, and coffee to convince yourself you are still in control of the evening. Each course throughout paired with its own wine, so that by the end you've sampled a small vineyard. The forks alone are a minefield. Each course brings its own implements, arranged in a regiment beside your plate, and the unspoken rule is to work from the outside in, never hesitating, never visibly counting, because hesitation marks you as someone who was not born to this. There are forks for fish and forks for meat, and forks for things you cannot identify and dare not ask about. You will, over the course of this single meal, handle more specialized cutlery than most people own in a lifetime, and you will be silently judged on your fluency with all of it. And here is the quiet truth of the whole spectacle. Nobody is actually that hungry. This is not eating for survival. It is eating as theatre, as status, as the slow, ceremonial burning of an afternoon's labour by dozens of people you'll never meet. You finish, eventually, pleasantly overwhelmed, and you rise from the table genuinely believing the ship could not possibly feed you more lavishly than this. The ship, with a small private smile, would like to introduce you to its second restaurant. As if a dining saloon serving 11 courses weren't enough, the Titanic offers a second, fancier option for the rich who find the merely lavish too pedestrian, the à la carte restaurant, run privately and modelled on the famous Ritz in London. Here you pay extra, actual additional money, on top of a ticket that already cost a fortune, for the privilege of dining whenever you please rather than on the ship's schedule, surrounded by rose-coloured walls, fine French cooking, and people exactly as wealthy as you who have made exactly the same decision. It is the maritime equivalent of bypassing the buffet at an all-inclusive resort to dine somewhere that charges separately, purely to signal that you can. And signal you do, because for this set the point of luxury was never comfort. It was the quiet satisfaction of being seen affording it. The room itself is a small triumph of soft seduction. French walnut panelling, gilded accents, rose-tinted silk on the walls, bay windows looking out over the sea, and small tables lit by shaded lamps that flatter everyone equally. There is none of the grand institutional scale of the main dining saloon here. This is intimate, designed to feel like an exclusive establishment ashore rather than a room on a ship, the sort of place where you might dine in a great city, except this great city is gliding across the open Atlantic at speed. The restaurant is not run by the shipping line at all, but by a private operator who staffed it with his own waiters and cooks brought from the finest establishments of London and the continent. These were not the ship's regular stewards. These were specialists, a separate elite of waiting staff, many of them young Italian and French men recruited specifically for the venture, serving a separate elite of passengers in a kind of luxurious bubble within the larger luxurious bubble, a restaurant within a ship within an ocean. The wealthy did love their nested exclusivity, and the real flex was the timing. In the main saloon, you dined on the ship's schedule when the gong sounded with everyone else. In the à la carte restaurant, you dined when you pleased, ordering individually from a menu, lingering as late as you liked over coffee and liqueurs. Some passengers who used the restaurant exclusively could even arrange to take a refund on the dining already included in their fare, which is a magnificent detail. The very rich, having paid a fortune for meals, paying a further fortune to eat elsewhere, and then politely requesting their money back for the meals they'd skipped. The economics of it make no sense unless you understand that sense was never the goal. Because that is the thing about this entire stratum of the ship. None of it was about hunger, or even really about taste. The food in the main saloon was extraordinary by any honest measure. The food here was perhaps marginally more refined, served a little more privately, by staff a little more exclusive, for a price a little more outrageous. The difference you were paying for was not on the plate. It was in the knowledge that you were the kind of person who dined in the restaurant, not the saloon, and that everyone who mattered knew it too. So you book your table and you arrive fashionably late, and you dine in your rose-lit bubble while the ship carries you west through the dark. It is exquisite. It is absurd. It is exactly what you came for. And when you finally drift out, full and gleaming, there is one more little corner of imported elegance waiting nearby, a place that has gone to considerable trouble to convince you that you are not in fact at sea at all. Tucked along the starboard side sits the Café Parisien, a bright little space designed with trellised ivy and wicker chairs to make you feel as though you've stepped off the ship entirely and into a sidewalk cafe in Paris, despite the inconvenient fact that you're in the middle of the North Atlantic. Younger first-class passengers favoured it, sipping coffee by the windows, watching the ocean slide past, performing the timeless ritual of being fashionable in a place built specifically for being fashionable. It is a remarkable bit of theatre, a fake France floating on real seawater, complete with French-speaking waiters and a menu to match. You came aboard a ship to cross an ocean, and the ship's response was to build you somewhere to pretend you weren't on it. The illusion is committed to with admirable seriousness. Climbing plants trail across white trellises along the walls, wicker furniture stands in for the iron café chairs of a Paris boulevard, and the great windows run alongside, framing the endless grey-green sea as though it were a particularly consistent street view. The light is bright and casual, the mood relaxed, the whole atmosphere engineered to feel like a charming little spot you've discovered on holiday, rather than a carefully constructed set on the newest ship in the world. It quickly became the haunt of the younger and livelier members of first class, the ones for whom the formal grandeur of the main saloon felt a touch stuffy. Here you could come in slightly less rigid dress, order coffee or a light dish, and pass an idle hour watching the ocean and one another. It was the place to see and be seen by people your own age, to flirt mildly across the wicker, to perform the eternal youthful art of looking effortlessly continental while doing absolutely nothing of value. If the lounge was where reputations were made, the Café Parisien was where romances quietly began, and the waiters naturally were the genuine article, part of that same imported continental staff, lending the place an authenticity of accent and manner that the decor alone could not. You could order in French, be answered in French, and convince yourself, sipping by the window, that you had somehow been transported to the left bank, even as the deck rolled gently beneath you, and the temperature outside the glass dropped, day by northward day, towards something that would soon matter a great deal. But let's sit with the comedy of it for a moment, because it is exquisite. The wealthy boarded the largest, most advanced ship ever built, a marvel specifically designed to carry them across the Atlantic in unprecedented style, and one of the amenities they most prized was a room that pretended the Atlantic wasn't there. You paid a fortune to cross the ocean. The ocean was the entire premise. And then you sought out the one corner of the vessel cleverly disguised to make you forget you'd ever left dry land. It is the same impulse, more or less, as flying somewhere exotic and spending the trip in a hotel that looks exactly like home, only with better coffee and a hull. That, in the end, was the deepest luxury of all aboard this ship. Not just comfort, not just abundance, but the power to edit reality itself, to take the vast and indifferent sea and tuck it politely behind a window where it could be admired but never quite acknowledged. You sip your coffee. France sort of surrounds you. The real world waits patiently outside the glass. And when you tire of pretending you're in Paris, You can always go and sweat, deliberately and expensively, in a room pretending to be somewhere else entirely. Down on the lower decks, glowing with gilded tiles, blue and green ceramics, and an atmosphere of vaguely Eastern fantasy, lie the Turkish baths, where for a small fee you may go and sweat on purpose. You move through a sequence of heated rooms, each hotter than the last, until you reach the steam room and begin to question several of your life decisions, then plunge into a cool bath, then drape yourself across a couch in the cooling room feeling cleansed, virtuous, and faintly poached. Attendants are on hand to scrub, towel, and tend to you. It is wellness, Edwardian style, expensive, slightly uncomfortable, and undertaken largely so you can mention afterward that you did it. The wealthy have always paid handsomely to suffer in tasteful surroundings, and the Titanic was happy to oblige. The decoration alone is worth the fee. The designers, reaching enthusiastically for an exotic mood, dressed the cooling room in an elaborate fantasy of the East. Intricately patterned tiles in deep blues and greens, gilded beams, carved woodwork, hanging bronze lamps, low couches draped in fabric, and small inlaid tables. The effect is somewhere between a sultan's retreat and a very confident hotel spa, an entire imagined geography assembled on the lower deck of a ship in the North Atlantic, so that you might recline and perspire amid the borrowed grandeur of places the designers had mostly seen in books. The ritual proceeds through a sequence of escalating heat. You begin in the warm room, easing in, congratulating yourself on your commitment to refinement. You progress to the hot room, where the air thickens and the congratulations grow fainter. You enter the steam room, where you can no longer see your own feet, and your every life choice rises before you in the mist. There is an electric bath, a then novel contraption involving heat and light, because it was the era of strapping electricity to everything and calling it healthful. And then, mercifully, the cold plunge, a small shock of cool water that resets you entirely, followed by a long melting collapse onto a couch in the beautiful cooling room while an attendant brings you something to drink. The attendants are central to the whole experience. There were staff dedicated to the baths, men and women on hand to manage the rooms, to scrub and massage, to drape you in towels and tend to your comfort with professional discretion. You did not operate the Turkish baths. You submitted to them. Even your relaxation on this ship came with personnel. The modern equivalent is booking the full spa package and lying still while a series of strangers do wellness to you for an hour, emerging convinced that you have somehow achieved something. And that is the quiet joke at the heart of it. Sweating fundamentally is free. People sweat for nothing daily by simply existing somewhere warm. But the genius of the leisured class was to take an ordinary bodily function, surround it with imported tiles and bronze lamps and attentive staff, attach a fee to it, and transform it into a luxury, a treat, a thing one did and then mentioned at dinner. You've paid actual money to be made hot, then cold, then horizontal, and you would do it again tomorrow, because in this world the surest sign of wealth was the freedom to spend it on things you didn't remotely need. Cleansed, glowing, and pleasantly emptied of ambition, you rise from your couch and reflect that the ship has offered you nearly every indulgence imaginable. Nearly. Because just beyond these gilded walls waits perhaps the single most improbable amenity on the entire vessel, a luxury so gloriously redundant that it has to be seen to be believed. A pool of the ocean, brought indoors, warmed and tiled, so you needn't trouble yourself with the actual ocean at all. Here is a sentence that should not have been possible. The Titanic had a heated swimming pool filled with seawater available to first-class passengers in an era when most people back on land considered indoor plumbing a luxury. You descend to find a tiled bath of warm salt water, gently sloshing in time with the ocean it was drawn from, and you swim in a boat on the sea, surrounded by the sea, which is a level of redundancy only the very rich could justify. There is something gloriously absurd about paying to splash in a small pool of ocean, while the genuine, infinite, and considerably colder ocean waits just beyond the hull. But that was the entire promise of first class. Take the dangerous, vast, indifferent world outside and serve it back to you, warmed, tiled, and entirely under control. The pool itself was a genuine novelty, one of the very first of its kind installed aboard a passenger ship, and the engineering behind it was no small thing. Seawater was drawn up into the vessel, warmed, and held in a tiled bath deep within the lower decks, lined with changing cubicles and lit so that the water shimmered invitingly. To step down into it was to experience something almost no human being of the age ever had. The sensation of swimming in a warm, calm, private sea, indoors, while the real one rolled past on the other side of the steel. There were rules, of course, because there were always rules. The pool ran on a schedule, with separate sessions for the gentlemen and the ladies, modesty being a serious concern in an era when a glimpse of an ankle could fuel a week of gossip. You paid a small fee, you changed into your bathing costume, itself a substantial garment, the swimwear of the period covering rather more than it revealed, and you took your turn in the warm water, perhaps under the watchful eye of an attendant, because naturally even swimming came supervised. Now sit with the sheer redundancy of the thing, because it is the purest distillation of the entire first-class philosophy. You are aboard a ship. The ship is on the ocean. The ocean is, by definition, an unimaginable quantity of water, stretching in every direction farther than you could ever swim. And the ship's solution to your desire to swim was to pump some of that ocean inside, heat it to a pleasant temperature, pour it into a tiled box, and let you paddle about in it for a fee. It is like flying over a desert and paying extra for a small bowl of sand to admire. The water was right there. They charged you for a nicer version of it, but that, of course, was precisely the point, and the point was always the same. The genuine Atlantic outside the hull was cold enough to kill a person in minutes, dark, bottomless, and utterly without mercy. The pool was warm, lit, shallow, scheduled, supervised, and entirely safe. First class did not sell you the ocean. It sold you the ocean with all the danger surgically removed, the wild thing tamed and tiled and made comfortable, so that you might enjoy the romance of the sea without any of its inconvenient willingness to kill you. The whole ship was in a sense exactly this pool writ large, the terrifying made cosy, the lethal made luxurious. You float there in the warm, borrowed seawater, weightless and content, the safest swimmer on the whole vast ocean, and you do not think for one moment about the temperature of the water beyond the steel, or how quickly it could close over a person, or how many seats in the lifeboats there happen to be. Why would you? You are warm, you are rich, you are perfectly safe. And when you've had your fill of the gentle indoor sea, there is still a gymnasium to visit, where a cheerful man in white is waiting to introduce you to a mechanical camel. Should the camel fail to satisfy your athletic ambitions, the Titanic offers a full squash court, deep in the lower decks, complete with its own professional you may book by the half hour. You change into proper kit, you take up a racket, and you proceed to chase a small ball around a sealed room while the ship sways beneath you, and the ocean presses silently against the hull just feet away. The court occupies space that could have held a great deal of something else, and the ship's designers gave it over to a racket sport, because a floating palace for the rich was incomplete without somewhere to perspire competitively. It is, when you stand back, a deeply strange use of a boat. But you're not here to be sensible. You're here to never once be bored. The court sits low in the ship near the swimming pool, a tall chamber rising through 2 decks with a viewing gallery above so that spectators may watch you flail with dignity. The resident professional is there to instruct, to partner, or simply to be soundly beaten by paying passengers who would rather lose to an expert than win against a friend. You booked your slot, you paid your modest fee, and for your allotted half-hour the court was yours. A small sealed world of squeaking shoes and the sharp crack of the ball against the wall, the sounds bouncing strangely in a room buried deep within a moving ship. There is something faintly heroic about playing a fast, precise sport on a surface that will not hold still. The ship rolls gently but persistently, and the floor you are sprinting across is, in the most literal sense, at sea. The ball does not care that you are on the Atlantic. The professional does not let you off lightly on account of the swell. You simply adapt, lunging and pivoting on a court that is itself in motion, which is either a wonderful test of athleticism or a quietly ridiculous thing to attempt, depending on how charitable you're feeling. Here, more than almost anywhere, the sheer extravagance of the ship's priorities comes into focus. Picture the negotiation that placed this court here. Someone, in the design of the most ambitious vessel ever built, looked at a large volume of valuable interior space and decided that what the wealthy truly required, deep in the hull, was somewhere to play squash. Not more lifeboats, you understand. Squash. The ship carried nowhere near enough lifeboats for the souls aboard, a fact that troubled no one, but it found ample room for a 2-deck racket court with a spectators' gallery. Priorities, on the Titanic, were a matter of comfort first and survival a distant, unfashionable afterthought. That detail lands harder when you know what came later. The court's position low in the ship meant that, on the final night, it was among the spaces the rising water claimed comparatively early. The professional reportedly noting the flood creeping up toward the playing floor, while passengers above still doubted anything was truly wrong. The room built for the most frivolous of pursuits became one of the first quiet measures of how much trouble everyone was in. But that is hours away yet, and unknowable now. For the moment you simply play, sweat, lose graciously to the professional, and emerge pleasantly tired into the world of the leisured at sea. Not everyone, of course, cared to chase a ball about. For the more contemplative souls, and especially for the ladies of first class, the ship offered a far gentler refuge. A quiet room of soft chairs and softer light, where the only exertion required was lifting a pen. There is a quiet, elegant lounge set aside for reading and the writing of letters, all soft chairs, gentle light, and a hushed atmosphere of refined intellect. In practice it became, by most accounts, a kind of genteel retreat for the ladies of first class, a place to sit, to murmur, to write a note to someone back home about how marvellous the crossing was. The room is calm, the carpet is thick, the stationery is embossed, and the letters composed here, full of cheerful descriptions of the unsinkable wonder you're crossing on, will in many cases prove to be among the last words their writers ever sent. But that thought belongs to a darker night still ahead, for now the pen scratches softly, the sea is calm, and the future is something that happens to other people. The room itself is a study in restful elegance, panelled in white, lit by a great bowed window that lets the daylight pool across the writing desks and the deep, comfortable chairs. There is a quiet of a particular quality here, the cushioned hush of a room where raised voices would be a small scandal, where the loudest sound is the rustle of a turned page or the soft scratch of nib on paper. After the bustle of the dining saloon and the theatre of the staircase, it is a place to exhale. In the social arrangement of the age, this became, in practice, largely the ladies' domain, the gentle counterpart to the gentleman's smoke-filled retreat elsewhere on the ship. While the men disappeared into brandy and cards, the women gathered here to write, to read a little from the ship's library, to take tea, and to enjoy one another's company in surroundings calibrated for calm. There is something genuinely lovely about it. A pocket of peace carved out of a floating monument to excess. A room whose entire purpose was simply to be still. And so you write. You take a sheet of the fine ship's stationery, embossed with the proud emblem of the line, and you compose a letter to someone at home, and you do what everyone aboard did in these letters, which is rave. You describe the size of her, the splendour of the meals, the marble and the gilt in the swimming pool. You mention, perhaps with a small thrill, that they say she cannot sink. You fold it, you address it, you hand it to be carried ashore at the next opportunity, certain it is merely the first of countless such cheerful notes you'll send across a long and pleasant life. This is the part the calm of the room cannot soften, and it must be said gently. A great many of the letters written in this serene white room, and the postcards, and the scribbled notes home, survive today precisely because their writers did not. They were carried off the ship, or recovered later, or had already been posted at the last stop before the open ocean, and they remain, in museum cases and family archives, the ordinary, happy, unsuspecting words of people enjoying the finest voyage of their lives, written days before the sea took many of them. There is no irony sharper than a cheerful letter from a doomed ship, and this quiet room produced a great many of them. But you cannot know that sitting here in the soft afternoon light, and you should not. So you finish your letter, content, and you set down your pen. Elsewhere on the ship, behind a heavier door wreathed in cigar smoke, the gentlemen have gathered for pursuits of their own. After dinner, by long and unquestioned tradition, the men rise and migrate to the first-class smoking room, a wood-panelled sanctuary of leather armchairs, stained glass, and the rich blue haze of expensive cigars. Women are not welcome here, which is rather the point. Here the gentlemen of industry and inherited fortune drink brandy, play cards for sums that would frighten an ordinary household, and discuss markets, politics, and one another with the easy confidence of men who have never once been told no. It is a clubhouse at sea, a place to be important among other important people. On the final night, several of these men would remain in this very room as the floor began, almost imperceptibly, to tilt, finishing their drinks, because panic was simply not the done thing. The room is the most club-like space on the ship. Deliberately so, modelled on the gentlemen's clubs of London, where men of standing had always gone to escape the company of women, children, and accountability. Rich mahogany panelling inlaid with mother-of-pearl stained glass windows glowing softly even at night. Deep leather chairs arranged for conversation, and over the fireplace a large painting of a harbour, a ship setting out toward the new world. The air is thick and warm with smoke, the murmur low, the atmosphere one of total, settled male self-assurance. The card tables are where the real drama lived. Gambling was a serious pastime here, and the stakes could climb to sums that would have bought a house ashore, fortunes changing hands over a long evening as casually as you might lose a coin. The transatlantic liners were notorious hunting grounds for professional gamblers, smooth and well-dressed men who boarded under false names, insinuated themselves into the games, and relieved the genuine millionaires of their money with practiced skill. A wealthy man in this room could never be entirely sure whether the charming fellow across the table was a captain of industry or a card-sharp working him like a mark. Often enough he was both. It is worth picturing the texture of the place, the clink of heavy crystal, the riffle of cards, the slow blue drift of cigar smoke under the lamps, the laughter of men for whom the world had so far gone entirely according to plan. They talked of business and politics and one another, of deals done and rivals bested in the easy, expansive way of people who had never seriously considered the possibility that anything might not work out. Out here, on the finest ship ever built, that confidence felt less like arrogance and more like simple realism. The whole vessel agreed with them, And that is what makes the final scene in this room so quietly devastating. On the last night, as the ship took on water and the lists tilted the floor by slow degrees, several of these men remained at their leisure in the smoking room, declining to be hurried. The ship's own builder was reportedly seen here in his final hour, standing before that painting of the harbour, lost in thought, having calculated already what no one else yet wished to believe. Others simply poured another drink. To rush, to panic, to scramble undignified for a lifeboat was for other sorts of people. A gentleman finished his cigar. For now, though, the brandy flows and the cards fall and the smoke hangs golden in the lamplight, and the men are perfectly content. Eventually the evening draws them back out, where the company recombines. The women rejoin the men, and the whole glittering society of the ship gathers in its grandest social room to round off the night. Modelled on a grand French palace, the first-class lounge glittered with carved woodwork, deep sofas, and a fireplace that crackled against the ocean chill. This was the social heart of the ship, the place to gather after dinner, to take coffee, to listen to the band, and above all to observe and be observed. Here, beneath the chandeliers, the real work of high society was conducted. The careful noticing of who spoke to whom, who wore what, whose daughter was being introduced to whose son, and whose recent misfortune could be discussed in tones of deep and entirely insincere sympathy. A great deal of money was in this room, and where there is money there is gossip traded as freely as the canapes. You smile, you nod, you file everything away. Civility, at this altitude of wealth, was simply combat with better posture. The room was designed to overwhelm gently. Its panelling and ornament took their inspiration from the great palace of the French kings, all carved scrollwork and gilded flourish, with a marble fireplace, towering windows dressed in heavy drapery, bookcases holding the ship's library, and chandeliers throwing a warm, flattering light across the whole assembly. It was meant to feel like the drawing room of an aristocrat's country house, and it succeeded so thoroughly that you could almost forget the country house was at sea, gliding toward a continent at the speed of a galloping horse. After dinner, this was where everyone of consequence drifted. Coffee and liqueurs were served, the small orchestra played its light and pleasant airs, and the society of the ship arranged and rearranged itself in shifting clusters of conversation. To an innocent eye it looked like simple sociability, a room full of well-dressed people enjoying one another's company. To anyone who understood the rules, it was a far more intricate performance. Every greeting and snub and introduction weighted with meaning, every alliance and rivalry quietly advanced beneath the surface of the pleasantries. For this was the great unspoken sport of the leisured class, the only competition that genuinely mattered to them, the endless, ruthless management of who was in and who was out. The lounge was its arena. Here a young woman might be introduced to exactly the right young man, a marriage between fortunes set quietly in motion over coffee. Here a family whose money was too new, or whose conduct had been too colourful, might find themselves greeted with a coolness no one would ever name but everyone would feel. The whole thing was conducted in smiles. The knives were entirely invisible. That was the art of it. And the modern reader will recognise the species at once, because it has never gone extinct. This was simply the original social network, the in-person ancestor of every glittering room where people perform contentment at one another while privately keeping score. The lounge ran on exactly the same fuel as any gathering of the powerful today. The deep human need to be seen with the right people, to be noticed, approving and disapproving in the correct directions, to come away from the evening having climbed however slightly over someone else. Money bought the gowns and the jewels, but status was the actual currency, and it was earned and lost right here. one gracious, lethal conversation at a time. You navigate it as everyone did, smiling and nodding and remembering everything, exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with effort. Eventually the evening winds down, the band falls quiet and the company disperses to bed. And in the morning, when the social warfare can resume in earnest, the great daytime stage will be waiting, out in the salt air, where the most prized possession is a well-placed chair. On a fine afternoon, the great thing to do is to stroll the enclosed promenade deck, or better yet, to claim a deck chair, wrap yourself in a thick woolen rug provided for the purpose, and stare meaningfully at the Atlantic while a steward brings you bouillon or tea. The deck chair is a serious matter. Its placement is strategic, sheltered from the wind, angled toward the sun, near the right people and far from the wrong ones. You will spend a surprising amount of a transatlantic voyage doing precisely nothing, beautifully, in a chair, and you will consider this a full and satisfying use of the day. There is a particular genius to the very rich, which is the ability to make resting look like an accomplishment, and nowhere was it practiced more devoutly than here. The promenade was a long, broad deck running down the side of the ship, partly enclosed behind glass on the Titanic so that you might walk it even when the weather turned brisk, sheltered from the worst of the wind while still enjoying the salt air and the endless view. Walking it was a recognized activity, a gentle constitutional taken arm in arm, a chance to be seen taking exercise without committing to anything so vulgar as exertion. You promenaded. The word itself is a small monument to having too much time, but the true art of the deck was the chair. Wooden steamer chairs lined the promenade, and securing a good one in a good position was a quiet daily campaign, managed largely by the stewards who knew exactly where each family wished to recline, and arranged the chairs and the heavy steamer rugs accordingly. You settled in, tucked the wool blanket over your lap against the chill, and prepared to do, with great commitment, absolutely nothing. Perhaps you read a few pages, perhaps you dozed, perhaps you simply watched the grey water unspool to the horizon and let the hours dissolve. The stewards, naturally, made even idleness effortless. Mid-morning they came round with cups of hot bouillon, a savoury broth offered to passengers reclining in the cold air, and later with tea, so that you need never interrupt your repose with anything so strenuous as fetching your own refreshment. You lay in your chair, warmed by wool and broth, and the entire apparatus of the ship bent quietly to keep you comfortable while you achieved nothing whatsoever. It was, by any measure, the purest luxury on offer. Not the food or the marble or the swimming pool, but time itself, vast empty stretches of it, with every need anticipated. And here is the thing the modern world has half forgotten and half rediscovered. We tend to imagine luxury as activity, as having things to do and places to be. But the deepest privilege the rich have ever known is the opposite. The freedom to do nothing at all and feel no guilt about it, to lie in a chair for an entire afternoon, attended by people whose job is to ensure your nothing goes smoothly. The wealthier board had elevated rest into a discipline. They were, in a sense, the original wellness influencers, performing serene leisure for one another, except their content was simply existing, expensively, in a chair. You recline, broth in hand, the cold, clean air on your face, the most relaxed you have ever been or ever will be. Of course, none of this effortless ease was actually effortless. It only looked that way. Just out of sight, an entire hidden population laboured without pause to produce it, including in many cases the very people you had brought along yourself. Many first-class passengers did not travel alone. They travelled with an entourage, a personal valet, a lady's maid, sometimes a nurse for the children, occasionally a chauffeur, because heaven forbid one cross an ocean without one's own people. These servants occupied cabins of their own, ate separately, and existed in a curious in-between world, too connected to the wealthy to be ordinary crew, too far beneath them to be guests. They unpacked your trunks, pressed your endless outfits, dressed your hair, and tended to your every whim, all while occupying the strange social purgatory of being indispensable and invisible at once. And when the worst finally came, this same invisibility would shape who reached a lifeboat and who did not, in ways no one wished to say aloud but everyone quietly understood. Consider the logistics of your own ease, because someone had to. The impossible quantity of clothing you brought didn't press itself. The jewels did not fasten themselves. The hair did not arrange itself into its elaborate evening shapes. And the children didn't mind themselves while you dined for 2 hours over 11 courses. Behind the seamless surface of your luxurious crossing stood a small private staff, your own people, brought from home expressly to make the journey feel exactly as frictionless as your life ashore. The very wealthiest families travelled with several such servants, an entire household in miniature transplanted onto the ship. They lived in a strange middle country aboard. They were berthed in cabins, often perfectly comfortable ones, but apart from their employers. They took their meals in their own spaces, neither at your gilded table nor in the crew's quarters, a separate dining arrangement for the servant class that belonged fully to neither world. They were near you constantly, intimately involved in the most personal details of your life, handling your clothes and your hair and your children, and yet they remained, by the iron etiquette of the age, fundamentally invisible, present the way furniture is present, noticed only when something needed doing. It is a relationship the modern mind finds difficult, this combination of total intimacy and total distance. A lady's maid might know her mistress better than anyone, might dress her and confide in her and spend more waking hours beside her than any friend, and would still, always, eat in another room and stand when her mistress entered. The valet knew which of his master's stories were exaggerated and which of his moods to avoid, and would still never, under any circumstances, presume to be his equal. They were trusted with everything and granted nothing. It was a closeness with a wall built straight through the middle of it, and that wall, invisible and absolute, would have its final say on the worst night. When the order came and the lifeboats were lowered, the rigid hierarchy that governed every meal and every greeting did not simply dissolve in the emergency. A first-class lady's maid, travelling with the family, often had a better chance than a third-class mother below, by sheer accident of where she stood on the ship and in the social order. But she stood, always, a rung below the family she served, and the cold arithmetic of who was helped first ran straight down that ladder. Some servants lived, many did not. Their survival, like everything else about their existence, was determined by a hierarchy they had no power to climb. For now, though, the sun is out, and the staff is unseen, and the machinery of your comfort hums along without your notice. And the people that machinery served, the great names whose every whim it answered, were among the most celebrated figures of the entire age. The passenger list read like a directory of the wealthiest people on earth, and you, being among them, would have known the faces well. There was John Jacob Astor, possibly the richest man aboard, travelling with his young pregnant wife and drawing whispers for the scandal of having remarried at all. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, of the mining fortune, travelling in a manner best described as discreet. There were Isidor and Ida Straus, who owned a famous department store and had been married for decades. There was the loud, warm, irrepressible Margaret Brown, whom history would later christen unsinkable. These were the architects of an age, gliding across the ocean together in a steel bubble of privilege, utterly certain of their place in the world. Most of their names you'll hear again before this night is through, and not all of them happily. Astor was the great prize of the passenger list, heir to one of America's vast fortunes, a man whose wealth was so enormous it functioned less like money and more like a fact of nature. He was travelling home with his new wife, Madeline, a teenager many decades his junior, a marriage that had scandalised polite society so thoroughly that the couple had spent time abroad waiting for the gossip to cool. She was expecting their child. He was, by reputation, reserved and faintly awkward, a colossally rich man who would rather not be looked at, which on this ship was nearly impossible. Guggenheim, of the mining and smelting dynasty, travelled in what the records politely call discreet company, accompanied not by his wife but by a companion he had no intention of mentioning at home, lodged with the tactful discretion that great wealth could always arrange. The Strauses, by contrast, were the picture of devoted respectability, owners of a famous New York emporium, married for some 4 decades, so seldom apart that the idea of one of them facing anything alone was, to those who knew them, almost unthinkable. And then there was Margaret Brown of Denver. New money from a mining strike, warm and brash and entirely unbothered by the disapproval of older fortunes. A woman whose courage the disaster would soon make legendary. There were more, a whole roster of consequence. There were railroad heirs and their college-age sons, streetcar magnates and their wives, a military aide to the American president taking a quiet holiday, a celebrated fashion designer travelling with her husband under a not very convincing assumed name. The combined wealth gathered aboard this single ship was almost beyond reckoning, a concentration of fortune and influence such as rarely floated in one hull. If you wished to meet everyone who mattered in the moneyed world of the age, you scarcely had to leave the lounge. They moved through the ship with the unconscious ease of people who had never once doubted their own importance. And why would they have? The world had arranged itself entirely to their liking. They had built railroads and stores and dynasties, bent industries and cities to their will, and now they crossed the ocean on the grandest creation of the age as if it had been launched specifically for their convenience, which, in a sense, it had. The certainty of these people was total. It was also, though none of them knew it, about to meet the one force in the world that had never read a passenger list and would not be checking their names. That, however, is for later. Tonight there is dinner, and dinner means the great ritual must begin again. The nightly transformation that turned these titans of industry into the most dazzlingly dressed people on the sea. If you thought morning dressing was elaborate, the evening transformation is a full assault on the senses. Out come the jewels, diamonds, pearls, sapphires kept in cases worth more than a working family earned in a lifetime, fastened around throats and wrists by maids with steady hands. Gowns of silk and beaded chiffon, tailored in Paris, are eased over heads with the care of museum curators. Men appear in immaculate white tie, black tailcoats, gleaming shoes, every stud aligned. The effect gathered together under the lights of the grand staircase is dazzling and deliberate, a nightly performance of wealth in which the costume is the entire point. You're not dressing for warmth or comfort, or even really for yourself. You're dressing to be a living advertisement for how very well things have gone for you. The jewels alone are a quiet inventory of fortunes. Diamonds at the throat, pearls wound in long ropes, rings that catch the light with every gesture, kept in fitted cases and brought out under guard, fastened in place by a maid whose hands do not shake even when handling a stone worth more than she will earn in her entire life. To wear such things to dinner on a ship in the middle of the ocean was perfectly normal among this set. The jewels were not for safekeeping. They were for being seen, and dinner was where one was seen. The gowns came from the great fashion houses of Paris and London, some of them designed by the very couturier travelling aboard, intricate constructions of silk and chiffon and beadwork that represented months of skilled labour and breathtaking expense. Each was a small architectural achievement, eased over the head and settled into place by a maid who treated the fabric like something sacred, because in the economy of status it more or less was. The gentlemen, in their crisp white tie and tailcoats, formed the dark, gleaming backdrop against which all this brilliance was displayed, every collar starched, every stud aligned, every shoe polished to a mirror, and then they assembled, all of them, descending that golden staircase into the glow of the dining saloon, and the effect was genuinely magnificent. A moving gallery of the finest clothes and the rarest stones on earth, gathered in one room, lit to perfection, each guest a small radiant proof of their own success. It was, in the most literal sense, a fashion show with no audience but itself, every person both model and spectator, the whole glittering crowd performing prosperity at one another over the soup. It is worth naming plainly what all this finery was for, because it was not warmth and it was not comfort. The clothes were heavy, the collars were stiff, the corsets were instruments of mild torture, and none of it made the wearer's evening more pleasant in any physical sense. The entire purpose was display, the conversion of money into something visible, wearable, undeniable. In a world where wealth was otherwise abstract, locked in railroads and ledgers and distant holdings, the evening toilette made it flesh. You wore your fortune so that others could see it and adjust their behaviour accordingly. It was the original conspicuous consumption, refined to a high art. So you dress, jewelled and gowned and gleaming, the most beautiful you have ever been, and you go down to dinner to be admired by people dressed for exactly the same reason. The admiration, of course, flowed only within the room. There was a whole shipful of other human beings whose admiration did not count, whom you would never see, and who were, by careful design, kept entirely out of sight. For all its open decks and shared ocean, the Titanic was rigidly divided, and as a first-class passenger you lived at the very top of a carefully sealed hierarchy. Below you, in second class, were the comfortable middle sorts. Below them, in third class, were hundreds of emigrants chasing new lives in America, packed into the lower decks with their own simpler dining halls and their own modest entertainments. Locked gates and barriers separated the classes, partly for American immigration rules, partly by simple design, and you would, in the ordinary run of things, never so much as glimpse them. You and they shared a ship, a sea, and a fate that was rushing toward all of you at equal speed, and yet you occupied entirely different worlds, stacked one atop the other, divided by a few feet of deck and an ocean of assumption. The ship was, in effect, three ships sharing one hull. At the top, in the light and the open air, your own world of marble and music and 11-course dinners. In the middle, second class, itself a perfectly respectable experience that would have counted as luxury on lesser vessels, home to teachers, clergymen, merchants, and professionals of comfortable means. And at the bottom, in the lower decks toward the bow and stern, third class, or steerage, where hundreds upon hundreds of emigrants travelled in cramped but clean quarters, carrying everything they owned toward the promise of a new life across the ocean. The separation between these worlds was not a matter of mere custom. It was built into the steel. Gates and barriers physically divided the classes, partly because American immigration law required that steerage passengers be kept apart and processed separately for health inspection on arrival, and partly because the entire social order of the age took for granted that the classes should not mingle. You could pass your entire voyage without ever seeing a third-class passenger, and most first-class travellers did exactly that, sublimely unaware of the crowded, hopeful world humming away just a few decks below their feet. And those lower decks held their own small society, modest but real. Third class had its own dining hall serving plain, hearty food in quantities far better than many of these passengers had known at home. It had a general room for sitting and talking, a smoking room, open deck space of its own. In the evenings there was music down there too, not the refined airs of the orchestra, but lively folk tunes, fiddles and pipes and dancing, the sound of people from a dozen countries celebrating the journey toward everything they hoped for. By many accounts, the genuine joy aboard the ship was loudest in steerage. It is impossible, knowing what came, not to feel the weight pressing beneath all this tidy division. Everyone on the ship in every class was carried by the same hull toward the same patch of dark ocean, at the same speed, under the same false confidence. The sea drawing closer in the night did not consult the passenger manifest. It did not recognize the gates, and yet the gates would matter enormously, because when the water came in from below, it reached the lowest decks first, and the people furthest from the lifeboats, hemmed in by the very barriers that had kept them invisible all voyage, would pay the steepest price of all for a separation they had not chosen. But that reckoning is still ahead, for now the world stays sealed, the gates stay shut, and you remain in your gilded lair at the top, where money smooths every edge and answers every need. Though out here, adrift in the middle of the Atlantic, even money begins to behave strangely, becoming at once utterly powerless and more powerful than ever. There is a curious thing about being rich at sea. The money itself becomes almost theoretical. You carry little of it. You sign for nothing. The a la carte restaurant, the Turkish baths, the squash professional, the wine, all of it is quietly added to accounts settled elsewhere by people you will never meet. Tips, generous ones, smooth your path. Stewards and stewards are rewarded for their devotion, and the devotion flows accordingly. Within this world, your fortune is not cash, but a kind of gravity, bending every interaction in your favour without a coin ever changing hands. It feels frictionless, effortless, almost magical, and it lulls you, gently, into the most dangerous belief of all, that wealth is a force of nature, that it protects you, that whatever happens to other people simply does not happen to you. The mechanics of it were genuinely seamless. The extras that carried a fee, the few shillings for the baths, the booking for the squash court, the wine with dinner, the cabled telegrams, were noted down and charged to your account, to be reconciled later by clerks and stewards far beneath your notice. You handled almost no actual currency the entire voyage. Money, in your world, had been abstracted into something closer to a permanent condition, a status you simply occupied, the way a fish occupies water without ever thinking about it. And the tips kept the whole engine purring. Generosity to the right steward at the right moment ensured the warmest welcome, the best table, the most attentive service, the chair in the choicest spot on the promenade. The staff, who depended heavily on the kindness of wealthy passengers, competed quietly for your favour, and your favour was easily bought. A coin pressed discreetly into a willing hand opened every small door on the ship. It was a system that rewarded wealth at every turn and trained you, gently and constantly, to expect that the world would arrange itself around your comfort. This is the soft trap of it, the thing that is easy to mock and harder to escape. When you have lived your whole life inside this frictionless bubble, where every problem dissolves on contact with money, you begin, without ever deciding to believe that money solves everything, that it is not merely useful but protective, that the misfortunes which befall ordinary people are, in some fundamental way, a thing that happens to ordinary people, and that you, cushioned by fortune, exist on a different and safer plane entirely. It is not arrogance exactly. It is something quieter and more total, a lifetime's evidence that the rules are negotiable if you can pay. The North Atlantic, however, did not take payment. This is the cruel joke the whole ship was sailing toward, though no one could hear it yet. For all that money could do aboard the Titanic, and it could do a very great deal, there were a few things it could not buy. It could not buy enough lifeboats onto a ship that had decided it did not need them. It could not lower the temperature of seawater, or slow the flooding of a compartment, or argue with the laws of buoyancy. When the moment came, your fortune would still purchase you certain advantages, real and significant ones, but it would meet, for perhaps the first time in your charmed life, a force entirely indifferent to your bank balance. But all that was unimaginable on a calm, bright afternoon with a steward at your elbow. For now the money did its quiet magic, the world bent obligingly, and the soundtrack to your effortless existence played on, courtesy of a small group of musicians you had barely noticed at all. Music threaded through everything aboard the Titanic. A small ensemble of professional musicians played in the lounges, the reception rooms, and the à la carte restaurant. Light, pleasant pieces to accompany your coffee, ragtime to lift the afternoon, gentle waltzes to soften the evening. They were skilled men, hired to be heard but not noticed, the warm background hum of a charmed life. You barely registered them, the way you barely registered the staircase or the stewards or the staggering improbability of the whole vessel. But their leader, a violinist, and his fellow players would, in the final hour, perform the most famous act of the entire disaster, standing at their posts and playing on as the ship went down, choosing music over panic right to the end. For now, though, they are simply the soundtrack to your effortless evening, and you do not yet know their names. There were 8 of them in all, professional musicians of real accomplishment, organised into a larger ensemble that played in the first-class public rooms, and a smaller group that performed in the reception area outside the à la carte restaurant. They knew hundreds of pieces by heart, drawn from a songbook every White Star musician was expected to memorize, so that any passenger might request a tune and have it produced on the spot. Light classical airs, popular songs, ragtime, waltzes, all delivered with skill and arranged to be pleasant, soothing, and entirely in the background. That was the strange position of the ship's musicians. They were, technically, neither quite crew nor quite passengers, employed through an agency and travelling in modest quarters, paid to be the warm sonic wallpaper of a charmed crossing. Their entire art was to be heard without being noticed, to fill the rooms with ease and elegance while the wealthy talked over them. You enjoyed their music the way you enjoyed the warmth of the rooms, or the steadiness of the decks, as an ambient condition of luxury rather than a performance by living men with names and families ashore. And then came the night that made them immortal. As the ship began to founder and fear crept through the decks, the band leader gathered his musicians, and they took up their instruments and played, first in the first-class lounge and later out on the boat deck in the freezing air, performing not to be admired now but to do the only thing they could, to hold back panic, to give the frightened crowd something steadier than terror to hold on to. They played on as the boats were filled and lowered, as the deck tilted beneath them, as the situation became unmistakably hopeless. What exactly they played at the very end has been argued over ever since, with many survivors recalling the old hymn nearer, My God to Thee, and others remembering a different, gentler waltz. The truth is lost in the chaos of that night, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that they kept playing. None of the 8 survived. Every one of the men whose music you had spent the voyage ignoring stayed at his post and played until he could play no more, and their choice became one of the few genuinely beautiful things in the whole catastrophe, an act of grace performed by men you never bothered to thank. But that final concert is hours away, unthinkable, impossible. For now the music is simply lovely and unremarkable, and you sip your coffee and pay it no mind, just as you pay no mind to another small marvel humming away high above the decks, where 2 young men turn your idle thoughts into messages flung across the sea, High above the deck sat the Marconi wireless room, where two young operators tapped out messages in Morse code across hundreds of miles of empty air, a genuine technological marvel, the closest thing the age had to instant communication. And the chief use first-class passengers found for this miracle was sending one another, and people back on land, an endless stream of utterly trivial telegrams, greetings, boasts, notes about the lovely weather and the marvellous food, dispatched at considerable cost simply because they could be. The operators worked frantically to clear this backlog of fashionable chatter, which is precisely why, on the final night, urgent warnings of ice arriving from other ships would sit waiting, jostling for attention against a queue of wealthy passengers wiring home to say what a splendid time they were having. The wireless was, in 1912, almost magical, and to the wealthy it was an irresistible toy. For a fee, you could compose a message, hand it to the operators, and have your words tapped out in code and flung invisibly across the ocean, to be received by a coastal station and relayed onward to its destination. You could, in effect, send a note home from the middle of the Atlantic, a thing that would have seemed like sorcery to your grandparents, and the novelty of it proved completely irresistible to people who had money to burn and a deep need to be heard. And so the messages they sent were, overwhelmingly, magnificent in their pointlessness. Greetings to friends, boasts about the splendour of the ship, arrangements to be met at the dock, cheerful little bulletins about the fine weather and the excellent food, dispatched at considerable expense for no reason other than that one could, the Edwardian equivalent of posting your dinner for the world to admire. The two young operators, employed not by the shipping line but by the wireless company itself, worked long, frantic hours hammering out this torrent of fashionable trivia, their priority being the paying passengers whose vanity messages were, after all, the business they were there to conduct. This is the detail that turns the stomach in hindsight, so let it land gently. As the ship steamed into a region thick with ice on the final day, other vessels in the area sent warnings by wireless, sober professional messages reporting the danger ahead. And the operators, buried under the backlog of passengers' cheerful nonsense, did not always treat these warnings with the urgency they deserved. At least one came in while an operator was deep in the paying traffic and was brushed aside. The instruments meant to keep the ship safe were, in part, clogged with the wealthy wiring home about the weather. There is a particular warning that has haunted history, in which a nearby ship tried to report that it was stopped and surrounded by ice, and the Titanic's operator, swamped and irritated, effectively told it to keep quiet because he was busy with passenger messages. The nearby ship, rebuffed, eventually switched off its wireless set for the night and went to sleep, which is part of why its operators heard nothing at all when, not long after, the distress calls began to fly. A chain of small human choices, each one understandable, none of them malicious, links a millionaire's cheerful telegram to a silence that would cost lives. But you cannot see any of that from inside the bubble. You simply hand over your charming little message and feel briefly like a wizard. There were, of course, passengers aboard who could not send telegrams at all, no matter how rich their owners, and who were nonetheless living better than most of the human beings on the ship. Naturally, the rich did not leave their beloved pets behind, and so the Titanic carried a number of dogs in considerable style, a French bulldog, Pekingese, Pomeranians, prize show dogs valued at sums that would have stunned the crew. There was a kennel where they were exercised and fed, and there was even, reportedly, a planned dog show to be held later in the voyage, because the only thing more first-class than crossing the ocean in luxury was making your dog do it too. These animals lived better on this ship than most humans lived anywhere, and in one of the small, strange mercies of the disaster, a few of the smallest among them, scooped up by their owners, would survive in the lifeboats, occupying seats that, in the cold arithmetic of that night, were not always offered to people. The dogs aboard were not strays or working animals. They were companions of the wealthy, pedigreed creatures of considerable value, some of them champion show dogs worth eye-watering sums, travelling with the same expectation of comfort as their owners. There was a prize French bulldog, there were Pomeranians and a Pekingese, an Airedale, and several others, a small pampered menagerie carried across the ocean because their owners could not imagine the inconvenience of being parted from them. A few of the very smallest were kept in the cabins. The larger animals were housed in a kennel and exercised on deck by the crew, who walked the dogs of the rich as one more service rendered. And there was, by several accounts, to be a dog show. An informal little competition was apparently planned for the coming days, a chance for the owners to parade their pampered champions before one another in the great tradition of the wealthy turning everything, even their pets, into an occasion for genteel competition. It would have been a charming scene, the finest dogs of 2 continents, judged on a moving ship in the middle of the sea, their owners beaming with the particular pride of people for whom even the family pet was a statement of standing. The dog show, of course, never happened, because the show that history actually staged was of an entirely different kind. But the animals themselves became part of the strange and uncomfortable arithmetic of the night. When the boats were being filled, a few owners simply tucked their small dogs under their arms and carried them aboard the lifeboats. And so, a Pekingese and 2 tiny Pomeranians survived the sinking of the Titanic, lifted to safety in the laps of their owners. It's impossible to state that plainly without feeling its weight. On a night when there were not nearly enough places in the boats, when men were turned away and families were separated and hundreds in the lower decks never reached the deck at all, a handful of lapdogs were rowed gently away into the dark and lived. No one quite knows what to do with that fact, and perhaps there is nothing to do with it except to sit with it. It was not cruelty exactly. It was simply what happened when the boats pulled away in confusion, when a frightened person clutched the small warm thing they loved, in a system that had never imagined needing to choose. But all of that lay ahead, for now the dogs were walked and fed and admired, and the prospect of a dog show hung pleasantly over the coming days, and the whole ship sailed on inside the single belief that bound everyone aboard together, from the millionaire to the lapdog, the absolute certainty that this magnificent vessel simply could not sink. Above all else, you carried with you a single comforting certainty, repeated so often by press and public that it had hardened into fact. This ship could not sink. The hull was divided into watertight compartments. The engineering was the finest in the world. She was the largest and most advanced vessel ever built by the most experienced shipping line afloat. The word unsinkable was not strictly an official boast, but it travelled mouth to mouth until everyone believed it absolutely. And so you boarded not a ship but a guarantee, a floating promise that the ocean had finally been mastered. Lifeboats, a formality, and there weren't even enough for everyone aboard, a fact that troubled almost no one, because why crowd the elegant decks with lifeboats for a ship that simply would not require them? Confidence, it turns out, is the most expensive luxury of all. The belief had real engineering behind it, which is what made it so convincing. The hull was divided into 16 compartments by walls that could be sealed off, the idea being that if the ship were holed, the breach could be contained, the flooded section closed away, and the vessel kept afloat. A respected technical journal of the day had described the design as practically unsinkable, and the public, never much interested in the word practically, simply dropped it. By the time the ship sailed, the conviction was total and universal. She was not merely a very safe ship. She was, in the popular mind, the ship that could not go down. There were, naturally, a few small problems with this faith, none of which anyone wished to examine too closely. The watertight compartments were not actually sealed at the top. Their dividing walls rose only so high, which meant that if enough of them flooded, water could spill over from one to the next like an ice tray tipping, filling compartment after compartment in sequence. The design could keep the ship afloat with a certain number of compartments breached. It had not seriously contemplated a single long wound opening several of them to the sea at once. And then there was the matter of the lifeboats, which is the detail that has appalled every generation since. The ship carried 20 of them, enough for only about half the people aboard, and this was not an oversight or a mistake, but a considered decision, fully in line with the outdated regulations of the day, which calculated lifeboat requirements by the ship's tonnage, rather than by the number of souls she carried. The designers had even considered fitting more and chosen not to, in part because rows of lifeboats cluttered the elegant promenade and spoiled the view, and in part because everyone knew, with perfect confidence, that the boats would never actually be needed. Sit with the staggering circularity of that reasoning, because it is the dark heart of the whole story. The ship did not carry enough lifeboats because the ship could not sink, and the ship was believed unable to sink in part because surely no one would build a great liner without enough lifeboats. The confidence and the carelessness fed each other, each excusing the other, until a ship full of the most powerful people in the world set out across the deadliest ocean on earth with places in the boats for barely half of them, and almost no one thought this worth a second's worry. Confidence, as it turned out, was the costliest thing aboard, more expensive than the parlour suites or the diamonds or the imported wine. And cradled in that confidence, warm and certain and utterly at ease, you climb into the softest bed of your life as the temperature outside drops, quietly and steadily toward freezing. At the end of each glittering day, you retire to your suite, where your maid or valet has already turned down the bed, laid out your nightclothes, and warmed the room. The linens are crisp, the mattress generous, the gentle thrum of the engines somewhere far below a strange and constant lullaby. Through the porthole, or from your private promenade, the black Atlantic rolls past under a sky thick with stars, colder now than it was a few nights ago, though you've no particular reason to notice. You sink into the softest bed of your life, lulled by wealth and warmth and the unshakable certainty that you are perfectly, completely safe. You sleep beautifully, and a few decks up in the dark a lookout strains his eyes against a moonless sea, beginning to feel that the night has grown very, very cold. The bedtime ritual was, like everything else, gently perfect. Your servant had prepared the cabin while you dined and lingered over coffee, turning back the fine linens, laying out your nightclothes and seeing that the electric heater had taken the chill from the room. You returned to a space made warm and ready for you, undressed with whatever help you required, and slipped between sheets of a quality you had long since stopped finding remarkable. The faint, steady vibration of the engines deep below, the soft sounds of a great ship at sea, settled over you like the most expensive lullaby ever composed. Through your window the ocean rolled past, black and endless under a sky that, on these final clear nights, blazed with more stars than you had ever seen, undimmed by any light from land. It was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, the kind of view people of lesser means would never know. You might have noticed, if you were the noticing sort, that the air had turned sharply colder over the past day or two, that the warmth of departure had given way to a deep, still chill. But why would you dwell on it? You were warm. The ship was warm. The cold was outside, where it belonged, on the far side of the steel. And there, on the far side of the steel, the night was doing something the warm sleepers below could not feel. The temperature of the sea was falling toward freezing. The air had gone bitterly, unusually cold, the kind of cold that to an experienced sailor carried a quiet warning of its own. Up on the highest deck, in a small perch above the bow, a lookout stood peering into the dark, and the dark was unusually complete. for there was no moon that night to silver the water, and the sea lay flat and black and perfectly, eerily calm. That calm, which made for such smooth and pleasant sleeping, was itself a hidden danger, though almost no one understood it as one. A choppy sea breaks white against anything solid in the water, including the base of an iceberg, throwing up a ring of foam that a sharp eye can catch even in darkness. A dead calm sea gives no such warning. An iceberg sitting in glassy water shows no breaking waves at all, no telltale white collar, nothing but a slightly darker patch of an already black night, visible only when it is very, very close. The lookout strained against exactly this, his eyes aching, the cold seeping into him, watching a horizon that gave nothing away. You, of course, slept on, warm and certain and entirely at peace, dreaming whatever the very rich dream. You could not know that the perfect conditions for a perfect sleep were also the perfect conditions for the thing the whole ship had been promised would never come, and you could not know that all through that final day, while you dined and lounged and dressed, the sea ahead had been sending warning after warning, every one of which the ship had decided in its great confidence that it could safely ignore. Across the final days as the Titanic steamed west at a brisk and confident pace, message after message arrived from other ships in the area, each carrying the same quiet refrain. Ice ahead. Field ice. Growlers. Icebergs. Drifting down into the shipping lanes, reported by vessel after vessel. Some of these warnings reached the bridge. Others languished in the wireless room beneath that pile of passengers' cheerful telegrams. The ship did not meaningfully slow. The night was clear, the sea was glassy and dead calm, and calm seas, cruelly, are the hardest conditions in which to spot an iceberg, because there are no waves breaking against its base to give it away. You, of course, knew none of this. You were at dinner, or at cards, or asleep in your royal bed, secure in a confidence that the ocean was about to test with terrible patience. The warnings were not vague, and they were not few. Over the course of that final day, several ships in the region sent word by wireless of ice in the Titanic's path. One reported icebergs and field ice at particular positions. Another warned of a large quantity of ice ahead. Yet another, a vessel quite close by that evening, tried to report that it had stopped for the night, hemmed in entirely by ice. The sea ahead was, by the testimony of multiple ships, genuinely and obviously dangerous, and the Titanic was told so, repeatedly, by anyone who could reach her. What happened to these warnings is one of the quiet tragedies threaded through the larger one. Some reached the bridge and were noted, and the ship's officers were aware in a general way that ice lay ahead. But the response was muted. The Titanic did not significantly reduce her speed, steaming on through the night at close to her full pace, in keeping with the common practice of the day, which held that a sharp lookout would spot any danger in time to avoid it. The confidence that had loaded too few lifeboats was the same confidence that now saw no reason to slow down. Great ships kept their schedules. Ice was a thing you watched for, not a thing you feared. And other warnings never reached the bridge at all, swallowed by the chaos of the wireless room where the operators, swamped with the passengers' endless social telegrams, did not relay every message with the urgency it deserved. This single, most pointed warning of all from that nearby ship reporting itself stopped and surrounded was effectively waved off by an overworked operator deep in paying traffic. The information that might have mattered most sat unheeded, drowned beneath cheerful notes about the lovely crossing. So the conditions assembled themselves one by one into something almost designed for disaster, though no single person intended any of it. A ship travelling fast, a sea full of ice, a flat calm that hid the danger, a moonless night that swallowed the light, lookouts straining without even the aid of binoculars, which by some confusion had never made it to the crow's nest. warnings ignored, delayed, or brushed aside. Each piece on its own was survivable. Together, sliding silently into place through that beautiful cold evening, they formed a trap that the ship was steaming toward at full speed, entirely unaware, and you slept through all of it, or dined through it, or laughed through it over your cards, wrapped in the warm and total certainty that nothing could possibly go wrong. Up in the dark, the lookout kept his aching watch over the black and glassy sea, and then, at about 20 minutes to midnight, he saw something directly ahead, rising darker than the darkness, and very, very close. Late on the night of April 14th, in water that had turned bitterly, unnaturally cold, a lookout saw it too late, a dark mass rising directly ahead. The order came to turn and reverse, but a ship of this size does not so much swerve as negotiate, and the negotiation failed. There was no great crash, no violent jolt. Most first-class passengers, snug in their suites, felt only a faint shudder, a grinding tremble that barely interrupted the card games and disturbed scarcely a glass of brandy. Below the waterline, though, the iceberg had opened a long, fatal wound along the hull, and the watertight compartments that were meant to save the ship would now, one by one, simply fill and overflow. For a while, life on the upper decks continued almost normally. The band magnificently kept playing, and the certainty you boarded with began very slowly to take on water. The lookout had rung the bell and sent word to the bridge the instant he saw it, and the officer in charge had acted at once, ordering the wheel hard over and the engine stopped and reversed in a desperate effort to steer clear. For a few held breaths, it seemed it might even work. The great ship began, slowly, to turn. But a vessel of such enormous size cannot dart aside like a rowboat. She answers her helm grandly and slowly, and the iceberg was simply too close. Instead of striking it head-on, she scraped along its side, and that, as it turned out, was the worse outcome of the two. The contact was almost gentle to those aboard. There was no shattering impact, no thunderous collision. Passengers high in the ship felt only a faint shiver run through the hull, a soft grinding tremor that lasted a few seconds and then was gone. Some felt nothing at all and slept straight through it. Those awake glanced up, mildly curious, and returned to their cards or their conversation. A few went out on deck and found chunks of ice scattered on the forward well deck, and some of the younger passengers below even played with the fragments, tossing them about, treating the whole thing as a small novelty in an otherwise pleasant evening. But beneath the waterline, where no first-class passenger ever looked, the brief soft scrape had done catastrophic work. The iceberg had buckled the hull and sprung the seams along a long stretch of the ship's side, opening not one compartment but several to the freezing sea at once. And here the fatal flaw in the unsinkable design revealed itself with quiet mathematical certainty. The ship could float with a few of her compartments flooded. She could not float with this many. As each filled and the water rose above the unsealed tops of the dividing walls, it spilled forward into the next, and the next, an inexorable cascade that no pump and no prayer could stop. The man who had helped design her understood it almost immediately. Summoned to assess the damage, he did the grim arithmetic in his head and arrived at a conclusion that the warm, confident ship was not yet ready to hear. She was going to sink, and there was nothing to be done, and there were boats for only about half the people aboard. The ship that could not sink had perhaps 2 hours left to live, and yet, for a strange and dreamlike while, life on the upper decks carried on almost as before. The lights still blazed, the rooms were still warm, the band still played its pleasant airs. Word spread slowly and softly, wrapped in reassurances, and many passengers, roused from their beds and asked to put on their life belts, treated it as an absurd precaution an inconvenience, a drill. The certainty was that hard to crack. But the water was rising, the bow was settling, and the moment was coming when the unthinkable would have to be believed, and the boats, the too few boats, would have to be filled. As the truth crept upward through the decks, the order went out. Women and children first into the lifeboats. But there were nowhere near enough boats, and so beneath that simple, noble phrase, an uglier sorting began. First-class women and children reached the boats in great numbers. Many were rowed away half empty, in the early disbelief that the unsinkable ship was truly going down. Far below, behind those same gates that had kept the classes apart all voyage, hundreds in third class struggled to even find their way up through the labyrinth in time. Some of the great men of the Millionaires Club, Astor, Guggenheim, Straus, chose to stay behind, a few famously dressing in their finest evening wear to face the end as gentlemen, while Ida Straus refused her place in a boat to remain beside her husband of decades. The sea did not care who anyone had been, but people, right to the last, very much did. The order to load women and children first was given in earnest, and the officers worked hard, but the loading was confused and tragically inefficient. In those first crucial stretches, many passengers simply would not believe the ship was truly doomed. The deck was warm and steady, the lights were on, and stepping off a magnificent ocean liner into a small open boat dangling over a black sea seemed far more dangerous than staying put. And so the early boats were lowered only partly full, some carrying a fraction of the people they were built to hold, pulling away into the dark with empty places that could never be filled again. Each one of those empty seats would, by morning, represent a life that might have been saved. The hierarchy that had ordered every meal and every greeting did not dissolve in the crisis. It hardened. The first-class passengers were closest to the boat deck, best informed, best guided, and most of the first-class women and children found their way into the boats. Far below, hundreds of third-class passengers faced a desperate maze, separated from the boat deck by the very gates and barriers that had kept them invisible all voyage, hampered by distance and confusion, and, for many, an unfamiliarity with the language and the layout. Some were guided up, many were not, or arrived too late, or never found a way through at all. The separation built into the steel for the comfort of the wealthy became, in the final hour, a barrier between people and the boats, and the men of the Millionaires Club met the end in ways that history has never forgotten. The richest man aboard saw his young pregnant wife safely into a boat, asked whether he might join her given her condition, was told no, and stepped back to wait with the other men. Another of the great magnates, understanding what was coming, reportedly changed into his finest evening clothes alongside his valet, declaring that if they were to die, they would die dressed as gentlemen. The elderly department store owner refused to take a place in a boat while younger men remained aboard, and his wife of some 4 decades refused just as firmly to leave him, sending her maid to safety in her stead and choosing to stay at her husband's side. They were last seen together, and they were not parted. These were not perfect people. They were the beneficiaries of a deeply unequal world, and their courage does not erase that. But in those final hours, something in many of them rose to meet the moment with a dignity that money had never bought and could not buy. The sea, of course, remained utterly indifferent to all of it, to the wealth and the names and the gallantry alike. It simply rose. And as the last boats pulled away and the great ship tilted toward the deep, the cold arithmetic of the night was already being written in numbers that would horrify the world. When the great ship finally slipped beneath the surface in the small hours of April 15th, and the cries from the freezing water faded into a silence the survivors would never forget, the cold mathematics of the night revealed itself. Among first-class women, almost all survived. Among first-class men, only about a third. In third class, where the gates and the labyrinth and the lack of boats took their toll, the losses were staggering. Wealth had bought marble staircases, mechanical camels, and an ocean served back warmed and tiled, and on that final night it had bought a meaningfully better chance of seeing morning, though not for everyone, and not by any rule anyone would dare call fair. So tonight, as you sink into your own ordinary bed, in a room nobody had to warm for you, perhaps spare a thought for the strange floating palace and the gilded, doomed, all-too-human people who sailed in it, proof that no amount of money has ever quite managed to buy its way past the sea, the cold, or the simple fragility of being a person, however richly dressed. The ship went down at around 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, breaking apart as she sank, and of the roughly 2,200 souls aboard, only about 700 survived, plucked from the lifeboats hours later by another vessel that had raced through the ice in the dark to reach them. Some 1,500 people did not live to see the dawn. The boats, the too few boats, half of them launched without their full complement, had carried away barely a third of everyone on board, and the numbers, broken down, tell a story no one is comfortable telling. Among the women of first class, almost everyone survived. Among the children of first class, nearly all. Among the men of first class, only about a third lived, many having stepped back to let others go. But descend through the decks and the figures grow darker. In third class, the survival rate was brutally low, and the loss of the children down there was especially terrible. A generation of young emigrants who'd crossed an ocean toward a new life and never reached it. Wealth, on that night, was not a guarantee of survival, but it was unmistakably a thread on the scale, and the scale tipped accordingly. It would be too simple and untrue to say that money saved the rich and doomed the poor, because plenty of wealthy men died and some of the poor were saved. But it would be just as untrue to pretend that where you slept on the ship did not matter, because it mattered enormously. Your distance from the boat deck, your access to information, your place in a hierarchy that shaped who was guided and who was left to find their own way through the rising dark, all of it followed, almost exactly, the lines of class that had divided the ship from the moment she sailed. The Titanic was unequal in life, and she remained unequal in death. The sea kept what it kept. Some of the dead were recovered in the days that followed, including the richest man aboard, found floating in his lifebelt. Most were never found at all, and remain where the ship came to rest far below, in the cold and the dark. The wreck itself lay hidden for over 70 years before anyone laid eyes on it again. The grand staircase long since collapsed. The marble and the gilt and the mechanical camel all surrendered to the deep. So tonight, as you settle into your own ordinary bed, in a warm and ordinary room that no servant prepared, perhaps spare a quiet thought for that strange and beautiful floating palace, and for the gilded, doomed, entirely human people who sailed in her, so certain of their safety, so confident the ocean had been beaten. They were proof, written in the coldest possible ink, that no fortune ever built has quite managed to buy its way past the sea, the cold and the simple, shared fragility of being a person, however softly the bed, however fine the gown, however unsinkable the ship. So that was your night among the filthy rich aboard the Titanic. You woke in a bed of Irish linen, descended a golden staircase like the subject of an expensive painting, ate 11 courses you didn't cook, swam in a warmed little pocket of the ocean, rode a mechanical camel for the good of your health, and drifted off to sleep certain, utterly, comfortably certain, that nothing in this world could ever touch you. And for a few short, glittering days, nothing did. It's easy to look back and smile at the lovely absurdity of it all. The dog show that never happened, the telegram sent home to brag about the weather, the 2-deck squash court built into a ship that somehow couldn't spare room for enough lifeboats. But there's something tender underneath the excess too. They were only people in the end, proud, hopeful, sure of tomorrow, the way we all quietly are. They believed they had finally outbuilt the sea. They were wrong, in the gentlest and most terrible way a person can ever be wrong. And perhaps that's the soft lesson rising up from the cold water tonight, that no fortune, no marble, no unsinkable promise has ever made a single soul less human. The richest and the poorest aboard slipped into the same dark together, divided all their lives and joined, at the very last, by the same simple fragility every one of us carries. So tonight, as you lie in your own ordinary bed, warm, safe, no servant required, no ocean waiting beyond the wall, let yourself feel how lucky that quiet really is. You don't need a parlour suite to be held and still and safe. You only need this, a soft place, a calm dark, and the gift of an unremarkable night. Rest easy now, the sea is very far away, and you have nowhere to be but asleep.